Welcome back to Ready for Merge, the podcast about the evolution of Bitcoin and Ethereum. I'm your host, Christine D. Kim. And today's show is the last bi weekly brief of the season. We're ending the season just like we started, with an update on the latest developments in Bitcoin and Ethereum. I want to thank all of my listeners who joined me for this first season of the Ready for Merge podcast. As I was looking back on the season and all the episodes that I recorded, this is the 30th Ready for Merge podcast episode. I saw a lot of experimentation with different show formats and styles and structures, some of which worked well, but others in hindsight, not so much. So I thank you to all of my listeners and my audience for bearing with me as I iterated episode upon episode throughout this season. I have a lot of learnings to mull over the summer as I plan the next season of this podcast, which I expect will come out later this fall. And though today's show is going to be the last that you'll be hearing from me on the Ready for Merge podcast for a while, there are still many ways in which you can keep up to date about the latest happenings in blockchain development via my newsletters and social media and events. So I'll be sharing more about those ways that you can stay connected and stay in the know about public blockchain development over the summer on the back end of today's episode. Without further ado, let's get into this week's biweekly brief. Okay. Starting with the high-level updates on Bitcoin and Ethereum development, I'll kick off this brief with just a few updates on the Ethereum side first. These updates are coming from my latest Ethereum development newsletter, ACD After Hours. And in this newsletter, I show that progress towards the Glamsterdam upgrade continues. On the latest Ethereum developer call, All Core Developers Consensus Call number 178, developers did share progress on various open issues and testing for the upgrade. There's no ETA yet on when this upgrade is going to be ready for mainnet activation, though developers are trying to get it shipped before the end of the year. Their initial timeline was that they wanted to ship Glamsterdam in the first half of this year, but given that we are in May and June is right around the corner and there's still a lot of work left to be done on Glamsterdam, it's safe to say that the goalpost has shifted to trying to get this upgrade ready for mainnet sometime before the end of this year. And on the last biweekly brief, I had shared some updates about the Soldan interop, where Ethereum developers had come together to work on the Glamsterdam upgrade in person. As it turns out, they also came together for that interop to discuss some important leadership changes at the Ethereum Foundation. 3 people who used to lead Ethereum research and development at the foundation are stepping back from their roles. Tim Biko and Barnaby Monod have announced their departures from the organization, and Alex Stokes, it's been announced that he is now on a 3-month sabbatical. And while these are pretty high-profile people to leave the foundation or take a break from their roles at the foundation, in the case of Alex, these are by no means the only high-profile researchers and team leads that have left the organization in recent months. Starting with the departure of Tomasz Stanzik, who was the executive director of the foundation he announced his departure back in February. And followed by him, there was a slew of other announcements. Ethereum Foundation Managing Director Josh Stark has left in recent months. Trent Van Epps, who helped with the protocol coordination side. And more recently, researchers Carl Bikusen and Julia Ma both have announced that they are going to be leaving the foundation. And while it's not clear yet what any of these individuals are leaving the foundation for, what their next roles are going to be, it's clear from the number of people that have been leaving, that the EF is going through another major organizational restructuring. And unlike the last one, which the organization announced with quite a bit of fanfare and quite a bit of excitement around their new organizational direction and mission, this restructuring, the organization is being quite tight-lipped about what is causing this restructuring and what is causing all these departures. I will say that the Ethereum Foundation restructuring is not uncommon in the light of the fact that other major cryptocurrency and blockchain organizations are also themselves going through restructurings, especially in the midst of continued market stagnation. ETH prices down, the last I checked, 30% year to date. And aside from the Ethereum Foundation, other crypto organizations like Dune Analytics has announced a 25% cut of their staff. Coinbase earlier this month, I believe, earlier this month, Coinbase announced a 14% layoff. So while the restructuring on the Ethereum Foundation side, there's still quite a bit of speculation about what is causing all of it. I will say it's not that uncommon of what we're seeing as a broad trend in the industry. The restructurings at the Ethereum Foundation in particular, though, as the foundation is the spearhead, it's the leader, the primary organization that coordinates Ethereum upgrades, coordinates different changes to the Ethereum protocol. So how these departures might impact Ethereum development remains to be seen. It will be important to watch which organizations, the people that have recently left the foundation with all of their institutional knowledge and technical leadership and social credibility that they've built at the foundation, what they end up doing next, whether they join an existing organization or start work on a completely new one, how their work interacts with the foundation's role and their work as the linchpin of the Ethereum developer community. I will say, as I noted in my most recent Ethereum newsletter, ACD After Hours, that I think this could be an opportunity for these researchers and for this talent to decentralize Ethereum coordination for upgrades away from the foundation, potentially. But it remains to be seen. And what will be important to watch is essentially what the people who have recently left end up doing next. On the Bitcoin side, Bitcoin developers are continuing to work on the Bitcoin Core V32 major release. And these updates can be found in my recent Bitcoin development newsletter, BTC Before Light. Here you can see the core release schedule. So the anticipated date for the next major Bitcoin Core release, Core V32, is targeted for sometime this October. And recently, Bitcoin Core developers had their own in-person interop in Barcelona, although updates on the main takeaways from that interop have not yet been publicly shared by developers. They did have their regular Bitcoin developers meeting on Thursday, the first one that they had since they came back from the interop, and they discussed various updates from different working groups and different projects that Bitcoin Core developers are working on. One of those projects is a new release or a new updated version of the Bitcoin Core wallet, which is nearing completion. And there is now a handy dandy project board for that initiative. For any developers that want to keep track of the progress being made on the new user interface for the Bitcoin Core wallet, you can find that in the updates, again, in the latest Bitcoin development newsletter of mine. And one other topic that I found particularly interesting being discussed in the Bitcoin Core developer community as of late is some backwards looking data and analysis on the adoption and the impact that prior major releases of the Bitcoin Core software is having on the ecosystem. Developers have recently been discussing one feature in the Bitcoin Core V30 release, which came out last October in October 2025. And one of these features was intended to improve the connectivity of Bitcoin nodes, especially Bitcoin nodes that are connecting from a home router or a residential through a residential internet service provider. Upon further analysis and data collection, it appears as though that feature that changed the default setting to the NetPMP option. Which, if you want more information about on what that technically means, please do head over to the full newsletter because I'm not going to dive into it too deeply in these high-level updates. But it turns out the change in that default setting didn't actually result in what Bitcoin developers anticipated, which is a rise in the number of reachable Bitcoin nodes running behind a residential ISP. It's an interesting example of how the motivation behind a code change or a feature in blockchain development sometimes does not actually produce the expected outcomes. And there's a variety of real world factors that may come into play that change the actual impact of the feature and make it different from what developers had expected. It also highlights why iteration, observation, and long-term data collection are such important parts of open source protocol development. Now, again, if you're interested in learning more about the discussion around NatPMP and that default option change in the Bitcoin Core V30 release, I encourage you to read my latest Bitcoin BTC Before Light issue number 40. So those are the high-level updates for this week. Now we are going to dive into the big topic for today's brief, the Clarity Act. For those of you who don't know, the Clarity Act is a bill currently being debated and discussed among U.S. regulators and lawmakers that seeks to create a clear and comprehensive regulatory framework for the cryptocurrency and blockchain industry. If passed, it would be the second major piece of legislation governing cryptocurrencies and public blockchains in the United States. The first major piece of crypto legislation was the Genius Act, which was successfully passed and turned into law by President Donald Trump last July. The Genius Act is primarily about stablecoins and regulating dollar-backed cryptocurrencies. The Clarity Act, however, is much broader, and it seeks to establish clearer rules and regulatory frameworks for cryptocurrencies and blockchain protocols more generally. Recently, the Clarity Act passed a vote in the Senate Banking Committee, giving it the green light to proceed toward a full Senate vote. And optimistically speaking, if everything goes smoothly, the bill could become law within the next few months ahead of the U.S. midterm elections. At least that is the goal for many that are pushing for this bill. But there are still some major hurdles ahead. Lawmakers still do need to reconcile the differences between the version that was recently passed by the Senate Banking Committee with the version that had been passed by the Agricultural Committee, and later on also reconciling any differences with the House version of the Clarity Act bill. All of this before reaching the final stage, which is a sign-off by President Donald Trump himself. And the reason why I'm bringing up the Clarity Act, which is really more a regulatory topic than it is a technical topic, is because this bill contains language that directly relates to protocol development and offers protections for open source protocol developers. And this section by section PDF that was released by the Banking Committee on the recent marked up version of the Clarity Act, they shared just a flyby section by section overview of the main parts of the bill. And some of the parts that I want to highlight in this deep dive on the Clarity Act on today's episode are the parts that directly impact protocol developers and, again, open source protocol development. Firstly, Bill introduces clear protections for software developers and open source contributors. While there is still debate on the exact language and how comprehensive these protections should be, it at its core seeks to codify into law a recognition that developers, open source protocol developers, should not be held liable for how their open source software is later used by others, especially if they have no knowledge of how their software is being used. So, kind of if you make that software and release it to the world, you are not liable for the ways in which people could be nefariously using that technology. That is in Section 604, the Blockchain Regulatory Certainty Act of the bill, Section 604 of the bill. The other section that I think is particularly notable is the section right after it, Section 605, the Keep Your Coins Act. The language in this section simply reinforces the right of individuals to directly control and transact with their own cryptocurrencies by having their own self-hosted wallets. This is a important principle underpinning the blockchain movement, the idea that you can directly own and have a right to directly access and custody your own cryptocurrencies. However, the more complicated part of the Clarity Act is how it leans on the concept of decentralization. And I've talked before on this podcast about how difficult it is to determine whether a blockchain protocol is actually decentralized. If you recall my spiels on the Arbitrum Security Council and the events surrounding the Kelp DAO hack, a lot of these protocols are marketing themselves as decentralized, permissionless, private. But during moments of hacks or governance disputes, you can often find that there are still pretty small groups of people that are capable of intervening and exercising significant control over protocol operations and protocol rules. The Clarity Act uses decentralization as a key factor in determining the disclosure and reporting requirements for cryptocurrencies. The tokens whose is dependent on the entrepreneurial and, quote, managerial efforts of others, these tokens are classified as ancillary tokens, and there are strict requirements for the types of disclosures that are required for for issuing these ancillary tokens, as well as strict guidelines for how much capital can be raised through ancillary assets. The Clarity Act does provide guidance on the fact that ancillary assets that do rely on the entrepreneurial efforts of others can become exempt from disclosure requirements if there is sufficient evidence of its decentralization. In Section 105 of the bill, it talks about network tokens whose value is derived not from the promises or the work of any particular company or centralized group of individuals, but rather from the growth and usage of a blockchain protocol itself. And historically, this kind of reasoning is what the industry has been arguing for years, that cryptocurrencies and blockchain technologies can become decentralized over time. So while the value of these blockchain protocols can begin from the efforts of a single or group of developers, that over time the value of these protocols actually disperses and becomes decentralized to the point where the value of that token is actually primarily derived not from a particular group of people, but rather from the usage of the protocol itself. But practically speaking, this is an extremely difficult categorization to apply consistently. After all, regulators themselves have not been exactly clear in defining decentralization in the past. There have been conflicting guidance from SEC and the CFTC about what types of assets are sufficiently decentralized and which are not. And more recently, the SEC has revised their guidance and interpretation on the classification of crypto assets in an interpretive release that was put out in March, the SEC defined which crypto assets should be considered digital commodities in a much broader way than it has historically. It wrote in its guidance, quote, "A digital commodity is a crypto asset that is intrinsically linked to and derives its value from the programmatic operation of a crypto system that is functional as well as supply and demand dynamics rather than from the expectation of profits from the essential managerial efforts of others." End quote. And now this new interpretation yielded the suggestion that examples of cryptocurrencies that fall under the categorization of digital commodities as being the following types of cryptocurrencies. So examples of digital commodities include Aptos, Avalanche, Bitcoin, Bitcoin Cash, Cardano, Chainlink, Dogecoin, Ethereum, Hedera, Litecoin, Polkadot, Shiba Inu, Solana, Stellar, Tezos, and XRP. So a much longer and broader categorization than the industry has ever seen before. The reality is that most blockchain protocols are not actually decentralized. Most are permissioned in some way. They rely on multisigs, foundations, security councils, privileged upgrade mechanisms, or tightly coordinated development teams. And more importantly, not all of these protocols or technologies do require a maximum amount of decentralization to function effectively. Decentralization does matter for things like censorship resistance and credible neutrality, as we've talked about in prior episodes of this show. And they are very important properties for ensuring the right to access your digital assets at any point in any time. But they're not necessarily the defining feature of every cryptocurrency or blockchain technology out there. In fact, this is not the defining feature of most. So, using decentralization as a primary legal test for governing cryptocurrencies, it may not actually end up being all that useful or easy to enforce in practice. Um, Understanding whether a protocol is truly decentralized requires deep analysis of governance structures, developer coordination, validator incentives, upgrade mechanisms, token ownership, and operational dependencies. And for even people like me who spend all day following Bitcoin and Ethereum development, the question of to what extent these protocols are decentralized is rarely black and white. Still, if passed, the Clarity Act would represent a major milestone. It would affirm that public blockchain networks are not simply a temporary speculative phenomenon, but an enduring part of global financial infrastructure that policymakers increasingly believe should be supported rather than suppressed. And at its core, the bill is about whether U.S. law will formally carve out space for open source and decentralized protocols to exist, evolve, and compete as legitimate components of the modern financial industry. But the bill also exposes some deeper challenges that lawmakers are only starting to grapple with. For example, how do you regulate technologies that operate globally across borders, but are still influenced by identifiable groups of developers, companies, validators, foundations, and users? Again, most protocols in crypto are not fully decentralized, and they do operate somewhere in between centralized and decentralized. And that gray area is what the Clarity Act is starting to create some clearer regulatory frameworks around. It is by no means the final answer to clarity on cryptocurrency and blockchain regulation, but it is the beginning sketches of an overarching framework that will start to be fleshed out with subsequent pieces of legislation. And over time, these subsequent pieces of legislation are likely to become more granular and targeted at specific types of activity happening in the cryptocurrency and blockchain space. And as that happens, lobbying and political coordination across the crypto industry is likely to intensify as different participants push for regulatory frameworks that benefit their business and their business leads in the cryptocurrency industry. This has already been happening with stablecoin providers that are lobbying for specific provisioning on whether or not their users should be able to earn yield on stablecoin deposits or not. And I anticipate that there will be more debates on new types of provisioning for tokenized equity issuers and non-fungible tokens that essentially expand and clarify even further the guidance that is started within the Clarity Act. Still, it's one major step towards legitimizing and entrenching public blockchains as key financial infrastructure that's here to stay. Thank you for joining me on this last episode of Ready for Merge Season 1. Stay tuned for the start of Season 2 of the Ready for Merge podcast coming out this fall. You can always stay in the loop about Bitcoin and Ethereum development by signing up for my Bitcoin and Ethereum newsletters, ACD After Hours, and BTC Before Light. You can sign up on my Substack, christinedkim.substack.com. You can also stay connected with me through the summer through my All Protocol Devs events, which you can learn more about on luma.com by typing in All Protocol Devs. Thanks again for listening. Until next time. Bye, everyone.